Okay, welcome back. So now we are on chapter 3, which is called Materialism versus Idealism. And I have a little quote at the top of this chapter which states that it's from Hamlet's soliloquy: to be or not to be, that truly is the question. Okay, so materialism versus idealism. Materialism and idealism are the two camps in the great ontological debate which concerns itself with the nature of existence. Ontology is the study of being, hence the great ontological question, namely, what is the meaning of being, of life? Death is clearly a challenge to our physical existence, and there's no denying, as Bertrand Russell duly observed, when I die, I rot. But what if science, materialism, who claims the mind is the brain, and when our brains die, we die, are wrong? What if we do have a soul that survives death? In Jainism, the Uttara easy for me to pronounce, Sutra 1813, states, a wise man believes in the existence of the soul. He avoids the heresy of the non-existence of the soul. And maybe existence is far more interesting than the sheeple give it credit for, like there's a physical world and a spiritual world. It seems the question of whether or not we have a soul is the ultimate question because it determines how we behave. The great philosophers like Socrates and Plato surmised that we are an eternal soul. They deducted that our soul leaves our body at death. They also rationally assumed there must be a prime mover. Someone had to be responsible for getting the proverbial show, life, on the road. And that someone was the god. It made sense that people were souls. It arguably feels like we're a soul tucked up in this body. But moreover, Plato knew we have an independent and inseparable soul spirit. He was apparently initiated into the mystery schools in Egypt, in a sarcophagus no less, where he mastered occult arts like astral projection. He could exteriorize his spirit body to traverse the spirit world. He knew there are two worlds, a visible one and an invisible one. Plato also believed in reincarnation. He surmised the only way to end these ghastly cycles of rebirth was by acquiring philosophical wisdom. We need to be familiar with the spirit world and be acquainted with the gods. Respectively, both Socrates and Plato believed in daemons, which are nature spirits. Daemon is Greek for knowledge. They prompt us through hunches and intuition, and they can be a force for good or evil. Socrates claimed he had a good daemon that made him challenge others on their wrong thinking. It also prevented him from doing wrong. Plato also engaged with daemons, which he located on earth. He called this host of invisible beings intelligent and wise, and he curiously stated they assist the governments of the world. Socrates and Plato further recognized that daemons could possess people and make them insane. It's noted that daemon became demon with the advent of Christian Judeo language in the 2nd century. Science admits that it knows very little about consciousness. It's a head fry. They do, however, know that the pineal gland is an interesting piece of kit. The pineal gland, which is named after the pine cone because it looks like a pine cone, is the tiny structure deep in the middle of the brain between the two hemispheres. It regulates melatonin, which is interestingly called the Dracula hormone because darkness signals to the pineal gland to make melatonin and light signals for it to stop. Thus, they know the pineal gland has to do with our sleep patterns, and they know that it calcifies and diminishes in size during teenage years. It's also understood that fluoride in our water supply causes this to happen, courtesy of those dastardly powers that should not be. The pineal gland is also known as our inner eye. Like when we imagine or visualize something in our minds, the interior of the pineal gland has retinal tissues composed of rods and cones, which are photoreceptors. And like the eye, it's also wired into the visual cortex of the brain. Thus, as a result of the nerve connections with the brain, it's known as the third eye. And the third eye is curiously known as our spiritual eye. This intriguing third eye is represented by the Bindis, Hindu gods and goddesses feature between their eyebrows. It's like Buddha's pinecone head represents the pineal gland, and like the massive pinecone in the Vatican courtyard. The great secret the mystery schools harboured throughout the eons is the pineal gland is the spiritual eye. By manipulating our pineal gland, we can access the spirit world. The pineal gland is viewed esoterically as the organ of perception of higher worlds. This inner eye provides perception beyond ordinary sight. It's associated with religious visions, clairvoyance, the ability to observe chakras and auras, subtle energies, and out-of-body experiences. Through practices like meditation, we can release the melatonin, which gives rise to hallucinations, or are these visions real? The pineal gland also secretes dimethyltryptamine, which is known as the spiritual molecule. It's structurally analogous to serotonin and melatonin, and it's similarly connected with dreaming. Higher levels prevail until adolescence when the pineal gland calcifies and shrinks. It's referred to as the spiritual molecule because it produces near-death and spiritual experiences, mystical experiences. People experience visions, voices, disembodied consciousness, novel insights, and powerful emotions. Like people experience an overwhelming sense of significance, the diametric opposite of nihilism. It can literally change people's lives as they realise materialism is wrong. It turns atheists into Gnostics. A Gnostic is one who knows. French philosopher René Descartes, who pioneered Cartesian dualism based on his infamous maxim, I think, therefore I am, argued for the independence of the mind, and he endorsed the pineal gland as the seat of the soul. Descartes was a Roman Catholic, so he believed in an eternal soul, but he also spent years researching the Rosicrucian secret society who engaged with the spirit world. In short, he rediscovered the ancient esoteric idea of the pineal gland as a gateway or connection between the mind and the body. The soul or the mind meets the brain in the pineal gland. He believed this is a place where all our thoughts are formed, and it's where we receive messages from the divine. So the practice of activating our pineal gland to produce altered states of consciousness is ancient, but it's back in fashion, and so is DMT. Whilst DMT, dimethyltryptamine, occurs in trace amounts in humans and animals, it's widespread throughout the plant kingdom. It's in hundreds of plants. DMT is a key ingredient in the shamanistic brew ayahuasca. When ingested, DMT is like a psychedelic drug, which shamans use to contact the spirit world, like they go to the celestial regions for healing and divination purposes. The shamans speak about seeing the gods, and people taking DMT commonly report encountering serpents. Whilst we'll get back to altered states of consciousness in another chapter, it seems pertinent to note Dr. Rick Strassman's clinical research into DMT, which was approved and funded by the US government. See his book, DMT, The Spiritual Molecule, a doctor's revolutionary research into the biology of near-death and mystical experiences, and that was published in 2000. Thus, from 1990 to 1995, he injected 60 volunteers with DMT. All volunteers consistently experienced visual imagery with their eyes open or closed, and many reported convincing encounters with intelligent beings that appeared in a variety of forms, such as gnomes, elves, fairies, goblins, spiders, reptiles, hybrid monsters, Hindu gods, native Indians, and grey aliens. Strassman believes that alien abductions are brought on by accidental releases of DMT. Whilst DMT is present in all of us, apparently 2% have high enough levels naturally occurring in the brain to birth spontaneous and involuntary trance states. It's suggested that DMT could account for psychosis, which can entail hallucinations, like seeing and hearing things that others don't. Many volunteers, however, refused to believe these experiences were hallucinations or dreams because they seemed too real. This was confirmed by the fact that creatures they'd met before in former trips to DMT space remembered their names. Hence, they were real, independent entities. They had their own personalities, just like us. These creatures exist in a frequency that we can't perceive. As mentioned, we only see visible light, which is a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. Strassman talked to them during the encounters, and they were aware that they were in two worlds. They could see the spirit world overlaid the physical world. They were aware that they were visiting this higher plane like intruders. Shamans also report this. They say that when they go to the sky, they feel like interlopers. They don't belong there. But moreover, it wasn't all happy days, as subjects were commonly raped and traumatized. There's apparently benevolent and malevolent entities or energies, so this place is not without its perils. The Bible, God's infallible word, tells us about the spirit world. In Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, we're told, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." So there's spiritual darkness in our world and in the sky above. Indeed, the Bible tells us there's a spiritual war going on. We just don't have the senses to perceive it, which is a good thing because it sounds insane. God's word also tells us that we're tripartite beings. We have a threefold nature. We're body, soul, and spirit. We're physical, non-physical, and metaphysical. Our body houses our soul, which consists of our mind, our will, and our emotions. Our spirit is our breath. God gives us breath, and we die when he takes his breath back. But our spirit is also our connection to God. It's our link to the spiritual world. People get revelation and insight in their spirit. Our spirit is like an internal advisor. God speaks to us through our conscience. We know what's right and wrong deep down, as Socrates insisted. Nietzsche stands corrected. Morals are not arbitrary. It's never okay to steal, kill, and destroy. But moreover, the Bible also tells us that we've got a spirit body. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 44, we're told there is a natural body and a spiritual body. But as Dr. Rebecca Brown, author of Prepare for War, which was published in 1987, highlights, this is a much overlooked verse. She asserts that few people other than Satanists and those involved in practices like astral projection realize this. Hindus also realize this, as astral projection is one of the siddhis, or supernatural gifts that one receives from this precarious, to say the least, religion. Thus, our physical bodies have a corresponding light body, a ghost-like see-through version of us. Ghost means spirit. And this astral body has astral senses. It's like our dream bodies have senses. Dreams feel real at the time. It seems our spirit body houses our soul when our physical body dies, and we can separate our spirit bodies from our physical bodies through certain occult practices. The Bible also tells us about various people who experienced astral projection and trips to heaven, like Paul had an out-of-body experience and went to God's third heaven. Whilst we'll get back to the biblical version of events, it seems pertinent to note that something catastrophic went down eons ago. There's a backdrop to our reality and current state of decomposition. Thus, Adam and Eve, the first people God created, were in the Garden of Eden, aka paradise, living the good life with God. They walked and talked with God, who is a spirit being. They lived in both a spiritual and physical world, and they were consciously aware of both their physical and spiritual bodies. They were clothed in light, presumably from their light bodies, but they betrayed God and everything changed. They were cut off from God and entropy ensued. Hence, everything on earth rots and dies, including us. Brown explains their souls controlled both their spiritual and their physical bodies, but at the fall, spiritual death landed. They were no longer aware of their spirit bodies and could no longer commune with God as they had done. God severed the link between the spirit and the soul, and they lost the freedom of being in two worlds at once. Our spirit bodies are the link to the spirit world, but these are out of action. It's postulated that Adam and Eve had their pineal gland fully functioning in the Garden of Eden, and after the fall it was closed off to prevent humans from interacting with the spiritual dimensions. The spirit world was separated from the physical world and became invisible. Thus, materialists assume we live in a physical world, but the spirit world is still there. We just don't have the senses to perceive it, or we do, but they've been shut down. After Adam, all humankind was born spiritually dead. We become spiritually alive when we connect with God, but we are not to activate our spirit bodies. God shut them down for a reason, not least because crazy shit happens in DMT space. Respectively, there's clearly a difference between the God of the Bible and the God of the Vedas, ancient Hindu scripture, and what they think is in our best interests. At any rate, we became dualists, believing that we have a body and mind soul. That is until we became monists and deducted there is no mind soul, but rather a brain that produces thoughts. There is no spiritual, only physical. As touched on, science tells us today there is no mind or soul. The brain is the key to our existence. Life happens in the brain. Contrary to the existential supposition that we choose our choice, apparently we don't choose anything at all, because there is no me or you. There is no self per se, and there's also no free will. As it transpires, the thoughts we have about a particular action come after the brain has initiated that action. For example, say we phone someone. Our brain makes the moves towards phoning someone, and then we have thoughts about phoning. The thoughts about phoning someone arise in our minds, and we naively think that our thoughts about that phoning that person started the process, but they didn't. On the contrary, our thoughts or consciousness appears to be some kind of byproduct, an epiphenomenon. It seems the brain chooses once it's made up its mind, and however counterintuitive, we have nothing to do with it. Or maybe we do. Paracelsus, the great Magnus, said, "The mind is not created by the brain, neither is love or hate created by the heart, but love and hate have their origin in the will." For Paracelsus, who knew better, not least because he frequented the sky, man is a twofold being, visible, material, and invisible, spirit, which are linked together by a soul. The internal living man is made from the breath of God. He advised, "The spirit of man comes from God, and when the body dies, the spirit returns to God. The body comes from nature and returns to it." The physical body is a mere corpse without the inner ethereal man. The inner man is the source of thought and imagination, and the outer man may act what the inner man thinks. Like Paracelsus, classical, medieval, Renaissance, Neoplatonist, Theosophist, and Rosicrucian philosophy all taught the astral body is an intermediate body of light linking the rational soul to the physical body. They understood the astral or spirit world was an intermediate dimension between the earth and the divine, and this astral world can only be accessed through our astral bodies. Contrary to the scientific consensus, it's possible our non-physical soul chooses, and these choices manifest in the brain. So when our brains get the memo, we, in our physical bodies, then get the memo. Our physical bodies act on the instructions given. We're given thoughts. Like Sir John Eccles, who lived from 1903 to 1997, he was a neurophysicist. He famously said, "The brain is a machine that a ghost can operate." I summarise this chapter as follows. It would appear we find ourselves at a junction or juncture. Science tells us there is no self with free will and there is no life after death, with a brain that processes information and then we die. Life is one big accident. So there's that. Or do we listen to the voice of wisdom within? Do we pay attention to the spirit tugging on our heartstrings? And in a mechanical vision, subjective experiences, including love, are reduced to physical and chemical processes. It seems life is even more pointless. But maybe love is more than mere brain chemicals. Maybe it's the most important aspect to our reality, and maybe it's the only thing that ultimately matters. It's also noted that our brains make decisions that we're not conscious of until we are, which affects our brains. Like we might drink and take drugs, which affects consciousness. So it seems our brains know that consciousness is the source of pain, hence the great mind escape attempts. It equally seems paradoxical that our brains decide, not us per se, what to believe regarding the idealism versus materialism debate. Our brain decides whether or not it believes in God. C.S. Lewis, who intellectually battled with Christianity until he succumbed to its higher reason, is credited with saying, "You don't have a soul, you are a soul, you have a body." But apparently it's not his quote. Maybe we are a spiritual being having a human physical existence, and perhaps the purpose of our life, God's breath, is to create our soul. Maybe physical existence is a breeding ground for souls, and the soul that we cultivate, the character we become, is subject to appraisal by the God. Perhaps the fact that we intuitively feel like a self that chooses and there's some moral game taking place is because we do, and there is. Maybe we should trust our senses. Moore, 2012, highlights a letter by Keats which said, "Being intelligent is not enough. Your intelligence has to be converted into a soul." He said, "Do you not see how necessary a world of pains and troubles is to school an intelligence and make it a soul? Call the world, if you please, the veil of soul making." And that was on page 29. So that's the end of chapter 3. So I'll finish here and we'll crack on with chapter 4. Okay.